Okay, unless anyone's got any objections, I think we'll get going. Okay, and if anyone can't hear me, then please let me know. Send me a message or something similar. If there are any problems or questions during the call, then please let me know. Speak up. Feel free to interrupt at any point, ask any questions. And on that note, welcome to the first Clean Code Nugget. We'll be looking at the subject of naming. I'm sure most of you have hopefully seen the introductory video, so you know a little bit of my background. But if you have any questions, as I say, please ask whilst we're going through. So in this presentation, we'll do a quick recap of what Clean Code is, why naming is important, and then we'll briefly outline some of the general naming guidelines and guidelines that are specific to classes and functions. So as a quick recap, Clean Code is all about making your code easy to understand and easy to change. This sounds easy, but it takes a lot of practice and discipline to do effectively. And you'll know your code is cleaner when you have a number of questions per minute, and the number of questions is reduced as you get towards good code. I've nicked this slide from Uncle Bob, and his terminology is slightly different, but it still gets across the same question. So are names important? Well, we've known for quite some time that using the right name for things is a good idea. And I'm not talking about the obviously wrong names. And here's a quick example. It's more to do with the getting things subtly wrong. That's more likely to confuse people, and confusion and lack of clarity add to the effort of understanding something. And in software, this equates to the cost and difficulty of maintaining your code. And remember that the majority of the cost of software comes from the actual maintenance of it. So if you can make your code easier to understand, you'll reduce the costs in the long term. So one thing that people are often reluctant to do is to change code because they'll think they'll break it. However, modern IDEs are really good at providing refactoring tools, and the standard ones for renaming classes and variables. So please use those, and they shouldn't break the code because they've been tested by the IDE manufacturer. There are a couple of caveats on that though. The standard one in Python is that you can't refactor or you can't rename quoted text. But this is a bad thing anyway, and we'll cover that later. The second thing, the more important thing, is that the IDE only knows about a certain scope of code. So if, for example, you're renaming a class that's used outside the scope of the code in your IDE, it won't be able to change that, and that will break this other code. There are also cases when you get onto writing database code. Obviously, you've got views and stored procedures. If you start renaming those, then that is going to affect more people if they know about them. A related question is when do we make changes of this kind? And my advice is to use a version of the Boy Scout rule, which has been adjusted for coding. So leave your code cleaner than you found it. If you're looking at code and it doesn't make sense to you, then it's probably a good idea to actually try and make a change so it's more maintainable in the future. So unless anyone's got any questions, I'm going to move on to the guidelines. Okay, so the first guideline is really about writing intention revealing names. What makes a good name? Well, you've got to ask yourself a few questions. Think about why does it exist, what's it there to do, and how is it going to be used. Let's look at a quick example. Here's some Python code, and let's have a look at the index. The index is set to 0, before it gets to the inner loop, and then it's incremented within the inner loop. If we look at how that index is actually used, then later on it's only actually used when we're printing out some information. Index probably isn't the best name here. It doesn't actually give us an indication of what it's actually doing. A better name might be found polygon number or saved polygon number, as it's the number of the polygon to be saved. So that's a quick example there. Let's move on to the second guideline, which is making meaningful distinctions. Basically, there are a couple of ways in which you can distinguish between variables that isn't very useful. The first is adding numbers to your variables. That's the opposite of revealing the intention of an item. You're really hiding things. They provide no clues as to what the intention of those items are. And with a little thought, we can give them better names. The other thing to be wary of is not to add words to your variable names that don't actually mean anything. We can refer to these as noise words. For example, you shouldn't use the word variable in the name of a variable. That makes no sense. And there's hardly ever any point in including the name of the variable type in the variable name. Is first name string better or worse than first name? Also, be aware that in most fonts it's very difficult to differentiate between a lowercase l, a capital I, and a 1, and between capital O and 0. So again, these shouldn't be used in situations where these characters can be confusing. One of the most important guidelines is to make your names pronounceable. If you can't pronounce it, then it's more difficult to think about it, and it's definitely more difficult to discuss. Here's a simple example. Is that get project live crd sys or get live project curd sys? You have to think about it, and it slows you down. Changing it to get project live coordinate system is a lot easier to say and think about. It uses up a little bit of extra screen space, but it's probably worthwhile. Another example is this variable name, fcstid, which isn't very easy to say. So maybe forecast ID is a better variable name there. A more interesting example is this one, cnxn. This is actually the PyOD BC standard name, so it's up for debate whether we leave it as this horrible kludge of a name or change it to connection. I'm in two minds here. Personally, I think connection is probably better, but I can understand people leaving that as cnxn as it is the standard name. So another important guideline is to use searchable names. Being able to search for things is very useful. A common example of this is this example where you have fixed values. There's 0 in the code. This is an example of Python code that's run as a tool within ArcMap. It's reading an input parameter from the ArcMap UI. And one of the common changes that we need to make on those is to reorder the parameters. If we're going to do this, then if they're just hard-coded numbers, how do we know we found all the instances of that parameter? There may be other usages of 0 spread across our code, and how do we know that we've got them all without having to run the software a number of times? We saw a similar situation earlier where we had a hard-coded string. Obviously we can search for that text, but we can't use the rename refactoring tool. And again, I would argue that the better thing to do is to replace those hard-coded strings with these values. So you have local variables that you can then search for and change. So moving on to another of the guidelines, using one word per concept. It's always a good idea to try and avoid using 2 or more words for the same concept. It's a very easy trap to fall into, and when it gets into your code, it can be a real pain to get rid of. First example of this is when you're using functions. When your function is returning something, don't use a mixture of get, fetch, and retrieve. Choose one and stick to it. Second example, a little bit closer to home, is in Data Checker. We have the concepts of site and mast. They both refer to a location on a map where measurements are taken. Both of these terms are used quite widely throughout our code. They're in source code, database tables, APIs, so it's not a trivial matter to fix this up. If we'd standardized on one of these things earlier on, it would have been a lot easier for us. This case also highlights the fact that the words that we want to use may change. Now that technologies are moving away from physical masts to remote sensing devices, using a term like mast that refers to an actual physical structure isn't ideal. Site isn't a great word either. So what word do we use? Measurement location? That might be an idea. Maybe it's better to ask the users, which brings us on to the next guideline, which is using domain terminology. Using terms that are known by the users of the software is a really good idea. They're the domain experts, and so it's a good idea to try and get them to reach a consensus on the terminology that should be used before you start to use it. If you're doing test-driven development, that's where the idea of acceptance test comes in. Use the terminology in those. Obviously, when you're reaching that consensus, there may be difficulties for a number of reasons in coming to that consensus. Within Res, obviously, we have regional differences across the world, but you can normally come to a conclusion on that. When you're using this domain terminology, it's a good idea to use that for UIs, APIs, database views, and any classes, functions, and parameters that relate to this. It helps everyone to become familiar with the user terminology, which is very useful when you're discussing requirements and doing debugging. An example of a bad case for this is rain sensor and rainfall sensor that we have in Data Checker. One of these measures rainfall events, one of them measures rainfall level. To be quite honest, I can never remember which is which. So that's using domain terminology, but at some point you're also going to have to use terminology that's specific to programming. The simple examples for this are when you're naming classes, you consider whether they're using one of the standard design patterns, for example, factory or decorator design patterns. Also, if you're using data structures, using the correct name for those data structures is really quite important. So one of the other things to consider is try not to put in disinformation in your names. That can really make things worse. Going back to one of the examples that we used in the introduction presentation, we started off with a coordinate system factory. Factory is one of the standard design patterns, and the name would suggest that it's actually creating coordinate systems. But as we identified in the introduction video, what we're actually doing is creating spatial references. So spatial reference factory is a much better name. You're getting rid of the disinformation of the coordinate system factory there. Another thing to avoid is encodings. They've been part of computing for a long time, the classic one being Hungarian notation, where the first 3 letters of a variable name define what type that variable is. The Hungarian notation was brought in because there was a limit to the overall length of variables, so we couldn't make them expressive, meaningful, and easily readable. But we don't have that limitation anymore, so it's not a good idea to use that terminology or that notation. I would argue that these names are much easier to understand They use up a little bit more screen space, but I think it's worthwhile. Now, when we're talking about encodings, there are a few cases which are exceptions to that. The classic one being the PEP8 leading underscores, and I'm sure all you Python programmers out there use this already. One more thing to avoid is mental mappings. That's when your code is forcing the reader to translate a name into another name that they understand. Basically, you're forcing people to do some translation, and it's a good idea to avoid that if you can. A common example is when you're using short names for the indexes within a loop. And as you can see here, we've got a 2D array, and the reader has to translate between I and the index of the wind speed data, and between J and the index of the wind direction data. It would be much better to explicitly name these indexes. So we've got wind speed index and wind direction index there. What will be even better is, instead of the code referring to the 2D array down here, if we replace that with a function that actually did the adding of that result. Yes, this code is quite a bit longer, but it's hopefully easier to understand, and that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to aid the understandability of the code, make it more maintainable. So does anyone have any questions about the general naming guidelines here?
Sometimes you've put like capitals and underscores, and sometimes it's just a like camel case thing.
Right. Well, if you're in Python, then there's the standard PEP8 guidelines, which would be the ones to follow there. Are there any specific languages that you're referring to there?
Yeah, mostly use Python, but yep. I don't know the guidelines well.
So I think this code we're looking at here is probably C#. So there's a different sort of convention for how you like capitalization and things. So I think in Python you use Pascal case for classes, which is the start of each word with a capital letter. And then you use, I think it's called kebab case for variable names, which is underscores between each letter and everything lowercase. And then you have like an underscore at the start, sort of semi-private things, and two underscores at the start for private things. Mm-hmm. And I think functions have the kebab case as well in Python.
Okay.
If you use PyCharm, it will tell you. It will sort of pop up a little like wiggly line under the name and say this is not following the PEP8 convention.
Yep. Thank you, Sed, for that very eloquent discussion there. Anyone have any other questions they want to ask at this point?
So, slightly naive, but you said at some point it was not very good to put first name string. But I was thinking in some case it's nice to know the type of the variable, otherwise you might wonder which type of variable. So kind of guidance and never using, like, never precising, never giving the type of your variable when you give a name.
I take your point there, yes. Obviously in some strongly typed languages that there is no point in doing that, but in some of the languages, knowing the type of the variable can be important. At the end of the day, what we're trying to do is to make the code easy to understand. So it really depends on coming to an understanding with the other people who you're developing the code with of what your preference is, to whether you need that extra information or not.
I think in Python the sort of recommended way would be to use type hints these days. It's a Python sort of 3.6 feature, I think. But like in this example on the slide here, that first line of code, it says for brackets int wind speed index, and int there tells you the type of the wind speed index. There is something similar you can do in Python, and that is the way you are sort of supposed to document the types of your variables. And I think if you hover over a variable these days, it will display that sort of information to you. So,
yeah, I think the time I use that most is with dates, because some things want it in a formatted string date, and sometimes if you're posting it to SQL or something, and then internal, you might want it just as a date time thing. So then I think I'd quite often have one variable called date something, and it was a date time, and then I'd have the string version which I put the same name, like start date string. So that feature would help avoid that, or is that kind of use okay?
It'd be quite tricky to avoid that because they probably both have the same name without the string bit on the end. But I think what you would do there, it's a bit sort of context sensitive, but they probably just tell you to, call toString on it when you want
so not store the same data twice in two places.
The other thing to bear in mind is when you're talking about dates, is the issue of what format that date is in. We'd also always recommend ISO dates just to avoid any ambiguity between US and UK date formats. But yes, Sed, you brought up a good point about those type hints. What we will do is after this presentation, any particular links that we've got that are useful, we'll put onto the Yammer Clean Code group, so you can pick things up from there. Okay, any other questions on these general naming guidelines?
Do you have a list of those you said about the standard constructs of stuff like factories and decorators and stuff? I don't think I really know what any of those are. Are they something I need to know, and is there a list of what those things are? So I know I'm working with Seb recently, and he used helpers and utils and things like that, which he's had quite a clear definition of, but I didn't know it until he explained it. I didn't really know what any of those things were. So is there a thing that tells you what standard blocks of code are, like decorators and factories and stuff?
There's a book.
Book? Oh, I was hoping for a slide.
Sorry.
I think we could probably put something around on the Yammer after as well.
We'll put a quick summary on it, but the names like factory and visitor and observer, things like that. The names mostly come from a book called Standard Patterns in Object-Oriented Programming, sometimes known as the Gang of Four book, and there's a lot. Basically, you can find a lot of summaries of that online without any place to look.
Thanks.
So, does someone still have a wall chart up in the software area? I know we did have one at one point of the design patterns.
There's one by my desk actually, and I think I have a PDF on it, so I can put that on Yammer.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions? I'm going to take that as a no and move on to the class naming guidelines. So the main thing to think about when you're naming classes is to use a noun or a noun phrase in the names. Some examples here: anemometer, energy yield, customer. As a bad example, here's some code, some Python code that we have. The class is called configure, which is not the best name for a class. How can we improve it? Well, looking at the usage of it, it's actually used to create a class or an instance of a class that's really a configured user. So configured res user is probably a better name for that one. There are some names that should be used with care because they don't tend to reveal the intent of the class. They can be very general or ambiguous terms. These are some of the ones that are probably best to avoid if you can. And if you find these names in use, it may be a clue that you might not have the correct class structure. You may have too much functionality in a single class, and you may be able to refactor that class into 2 or more separate classes. But that's getting on towards the subject of some more of the clean code nuggets that we'll have further down the line. When you're naming functions, conversely, you want to use a verb or a verb phrase. Here are some simple examples. Note again, if you're struggling to name a function, it could be a sign that you're trying to shoehorn too much into that one function, and you might want to think about replacing that one with multiple other ones. Don't worry if you end up with quite long function names. If the length is required to make it clear what the function's doing and differentiate it from similar functions, then that isn't normally a problem. A prime example of this is test functions, where you may have a large number of functions that are running tests that are very similar, but testing different use cases. Here's a quick example of some of the test functions from some of our C# code. So that's it for today. That's just given a brief introduction to naming, covering these general naming guidelines and the ones that are specific to classes and functions. Does anyone have any questions? Any further questions? One thing I would point out is that obviously this is the first of these nuggets, so we have possibly got this at the right level. Possibly it's too simplistic for some people, possibly too complicated for others, but I would value your feedback on that, and also the content that we have here, the format as well. If you do have any suggestions on that, then please let me know. Okay, any other questions? Nope. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone. This meeting has hopefully been recorded, and we will be making it available as a video on the stream channel that we have. As I mentioned, we will also be putting some links, some useful links, the design patterns, PDF, type hints, etc., on the Yammer group to help you guys out. So unless anyone has any other comments, then thank you very much. And the second nugget covering functions will be coming out soon. So thanks again, and happy coding.